Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to our new season nitrogen webinar titled Don't Buy Your Nitrogen Till You've Watched This. My name is Eva Ross, Marketing and PR Manager for Yara UK and Ireland, and I'm delighted to be joined by James Webster, Senior Analyst with AHDB, and Natalie Wood, our Yara arable agronomist for Yara UK and Ireland. James is going to cover how crops are shaping up this season, projections of yields per crop, market intelligence information, and forward-looking trends of interest. And then Natalie will take us through sulfur, P&K, physical properties and emissions, and all those things that we need to be thinking about before we go out to buy our fertiliser for next season. So before I just hand over to James, just to say that we have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. So please submit your questions there while James and Natalie are presenting. And at this stage, I'd like to hand over to you, James. James.
Excellent, thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my screen. So as Eva said, I'm going to run through some of the key trends we are seeing this year. We'll have a bit of a look at what crop conditions were looking like at the point of our most recent report, look at some of the trends and factors which may have impacted crops over the last couple of months, and then we will also have a bit of a look forward at some of the global market trends. So we just start by looking at how crops fared this year. I think understandably for pretty much everyone, crops got off to a much better start this year, both from a better drilling window, but also better weather during the winter months. So we're seeing an increase in crop areas for winter crops across the board, and a return to more trend area for wheat, and a return to trend for winter barley as well. We are continuing to see declines in oilseed rape area. Obviously, there's a number of challenges for oilseed rape, particularly surrounding cabbage stem flea beetle and the availability of things like neonicotinoids to manage some of those pressures. So that's a trend we've seen over some time, although prices have been very strong. So going forward, we may see a bit of a return to area. Our most recent report for crop conditions was as at the end of March, and like I said, crops were faring much better at that point. So if you compare the winter wheat bars, you can see that the proportion of the crop that was sort of in that fair to excellent window was much improved, and that's the same for winter barley and winter oilseed rape. Worth bearing in mind that obviously alongside crops looking very, very healthy at that point, we also had much bigger areas. So in terms of a usable volume of production, we're looking at a much better supply going into the next season. And we can use that report to start to have a bit of a think about what we might see for some of the winter crop yields. So these two graphs here use a methodology looking at yields over the last 5 years, and then we look at how the crop was rated and give a yield score accordingly. So if the crop was looking fair, or a proportion of the crop was looking fair, it's got a 5-year average yield. And then for very poor, we're looking at a 5-year min, excellent 5-year max, and then around that we're looking at plus or minus 5%. So yields for winter crops, you can see on the left there, are looking much healthier potentially than last year. Not quite up to the peaks, but certainly looking fairly average at present. For oilseed rape, similarly, we're looking at probably a more average yield as things currently stand. Of course, this is purely a mathematical method, and it's difficult to give a true estimate for yield at this moment in time, but certainly as far as domestic production goes, we're looking at some recoveries relative to where we've been in the current year. The USDA has also recently published figures for UK supply and demand. It's part of their new process. Is obviously we've now left the European Union. They're reporting UK crops separately. They've got slightly lower figures for wheat. Their barley figure is a whole barley figure, so I've not put that separately. And for oilseed rape, their figure is actually quite high relative to where we've been. Again, it's going to be probably looking more at a trend yield analysis from them as it is from us at the moment, and we have to consider how crops are going to develop over the coming months. I said crops got off to a good start, and we'll continue having a bit more of a look at the weather recently in a second. Just have a think about what that potentially means, those last figures for GB wheat production specifically. We're looking at a crop which is going to be ahead of the 5-year average as things currently stand, and again, this is in line probably with most industry expectations. The average does include last year's crop, which is why it's probably maybe slightly on the lower side than we've seen in recent years. Last year was obviously a pretty small GB crop at around 9.5 million tonnes, and the year before that 16 million tonnes. But on the whole, we're looking at pretty healthy wheat production next year. However, I would caveat that by saying, with this year having been so tight, we've got low stocks coming into this year, and from a price perspective, that's going to leave UK wheat needing to price towards the top of the market in order to draw in what is still probably going to be a fairly comfortable level of wheat imports. As I said, also need to consider what the weather's done, and while crops got off to a good start through to March, April and early May, weather data suggests that things have been probably less than ideal, to say the least. Rainfall in April was bare minimum for pretty much everyone, and you can see from on the left hand side of these 4 graphs, you've also got the days of ground frost that we had relative to the trend for 1981 and 2010, and we're looking at 2+ days above normal, in some cases getting up to around 10 more days of ground frost in April than normal levels. That hit at a time when, certainly towards the end of the month, we had oilseed rape flowering, and I think in many regions that could have stunted things. That said, as we come into May, we've seen more rainfall and slightly warmer temperatures, although not relative to April, not necessarily relative to the long-term trend. And certainly what I've seen, local to where I am, obviously we're not able to travel particularly far at the moment, but also from speaking to other people, crops seem to have moved on pretty well in the last few weeks, and things are beginning to look a little bit healthier. So it's difficult to judge the impact on yield, as I said, at the moment, but that April and May weather is something that we need to consider very closely, and April was less than ideal, to say the least. So that kind of gives a bit of a framing of what we're looking at in terms of potential yields and then production. So for wheat, we're looking at that above average, but with low stocks. Oilseed rape, we're looking at a pretty minimal production figure relative to demand, because we had a low area and yields, not breaking the bank. So what does that mean in terms of crop pricing and what's happening at the moment? For new crop grain futures markets, we've seen a lot of volatility of late. So as we've come into early May, we saw new crop Chicago maize prices, which have really been the driver of global grain markets, rally considerably. And then in the last couple of weeks, we saw some big production numbers for global new crop grain, so the 21-22 crop, particularly for maize, and also some old crop production figures as well, which I'll come on to in a second. And they really have pulled the market back, and we've seen wheat values fall back in kind. It may not necessarily be the true end of some of the support for prices. I think there's still some factors we need to watch. And chief amongst them really is the condition of crops that are in the ground, and the reason that the volatility has been so high is that there's still a lot of uncertainty around the weather. The Brazilian maize crop, which, looking at the soil moisture in Brazil on the right there, pretty much where those red areas are the primary growing regions for Brazil's second and largest maize crop. So estimates that we've seen, official estimates, are probably still a little bit hot on the high side for that crop, and I think if we see those come down further, we could see further volatility. We also need to consider what's going on with crops that are developing, so Northern Hemisphere wheat and US wheat, but also the US maize planting, which is going on, and how that develops. The US is expecting to see a recovery in maize area this year. It's something, again, it's an unknown because plantings are ongoing, but it's something that needs watching closely. If we see adverse impacts for US maize or continued poor weather in South America, which the forecast is currently pointing to for South America, certainly, then we could well see further volatility on the horizon. Additionally to those supply side factors, we also need to have a think about the demand picture, which has also been a huge fueler of the price rallies that we've seen recently. And one thing which we can't ignore in the market at present is the impact of China. Historically, when we've looked at stocks to use, and something that we've done lately, we exclude China because their stock figures are so unknown. There's a lot of secrecy and just imperfect information around data out of China, but China is currently importing so much more grain than it normally does that it's completely tightening up the global supply and demand picture. You can see in this graph on the left hand side, they've pretty much doubled and then some their import of barley, maize and wheat, and the same is true for their soybean imports as well, and that's why we've seen some of the support for soybean prices, and it's just continuing to firm the market and support prices. We've started to see a bit of a tapering down of the 2020-21 demand, in particular for US maize, but as that's tapered down, China has come in a big way for new crop maize in the last couple of weeks. Again, another potential reason why we could continue to see some price support as we move forwards. The other key demand thing we need to think about, and it's sort of outside of the fundamentals of grain markets at the moment, is the impact of speculative demand. There's a lot of big fund positions currently held by managed money, so your pension funds and people that don't necessarily have the best agricultural knowledge in terms of trading that market, but are seeing an opportunity based on the financial strength. And as that position has grown, it's just fueled the rally. We need to watch it very closely, because if we were to see a pullback from that position and those positions that are held in expectation that prices are going to rise higher, if we see that fall back, then markets could move back in a big way. But also, if they continue to hold those large positions, then we could see prices continue to see some support or see some further support, because after the last couple of weeks, we've seen prices fall back pretty significantly. From an oilseeds perspective, we are continuing to again see support. China, like I said, buying a lot of soybeans, but generally speaking, the vegetable oil market is incredibly tight, and that's just keeping rapeseed crops or rapeseed prices elevated. We're expecting, like I mentioned, a tighter crop in the UK for this year coming, and then we're expecting tight EU crops as well, and that whole supply picture just staying so firm, coupled with all of this extra vegetable oil volatility that we're seeing, both on coronavirus demand concerns, but also just generally on global market support and support for crude oil and various different factors is just keeping that price outlook for oilseeds supported. Looking ahead, so thinking slightly further down the line, maybe to what we might see in terms of demand for inputs, we're expecting to see a strong area once more planted to grains and similarly for global oilseeds, and that's really being driven by the high prices and strong demand that we're seeing at the moment. On the flip side of that, we could still see the market stay relatively tight. So stocks to use ratios, as I mentioned, are a measure of the supply and demand in the market. And here we're just looking at maize stocks to use. Looking at this season, we know it's been very tight and the market has been elevated as such. But also looking ahead to next season, it's still going to remain relatively tight, both on a global scale and then also globally, excluding China. However, if we do see further contractions, as I mentioned, we've still got a lot of concern about the South American crop that's still to be harvested and is currently going through some key development stages in some very dry weather, then we could well see that market tighten further, and we could see this year tighten, but also next year tighten to similar sorts of levels, certainly on a global scale to what we've seen this year. So that's pretty much it from me. So we've seen UK crops get off to a very good start, whether in April and early May rather, has been challenging for many, and that's something which is still to really see the impact on yield and see how that bears out. But certainly crop production is understandably looking better as we move into the next season. As I mentioned, demand for the UK crop, all that general picture with the tight stocks we've had this year is probably going to keep the UK price supported to the top of the market. Globally, we've seen prices fueled by supply concerns and weather concerns, and while they've eased slightly, there are still one or two irons in the fire that could see a bit of support come back, and demand is certainly one of those and remains strong. So that's it from me. I'll now hand over to Natalie, who will give you a run through of some key bits from Yara.
Thanks, James. Just wait for my screen to load here. Okay, so thanks for that. Really interesting stuff there on the market side of things. What I'm going to do now is run through some other key aspects when you want to kind of think about before you choose your fertilizers. So as I mentioned, sulfur, P and K, then some of the physical properties and also emissions as this becomes ever important. So if we start then with the key messages really from today's webinar, don't rush fertilizer decisions. This is the main key point really of what I'm going to talk about today. How much straight nitrogen do we actually need? And the answer really is 0 to 25%, which you might think, well, where have you got that from? But we will go through why that is, and basically it's because we need to take those other nutrients into account as well, such as sulfur, P and K. So if we start with sulfur management in particular, arable soils, we know over history are now more than 90% deficient in sulfur. So you can see from the graph there, as that's changed over the past 15 years, we've got more and more towards that 100%. And of course, this means there is that organic/mineral fertilizer requirement needed to meet that crop demand. As a couple of examples for requirements for different crops, then if we look at cereals, you can see we're recommending 40 to 50 kilograms of SO3, and then for oilseed, you're looking at 75 to 100 kilograms of SO3 there. So sulfur demand is slightly different, I guess, to NP and K, because there's a requirement of a more even demand across the season, with that March to June being the small peak in the crop demand, with this graph here, which is wheat as an example. So you can see we've got a big peak for potassium in the yellow, a peak for phosphate and a peak for nitrogen, but you can see that sulfur demand steadily goes throughout the season there. So how do we kind of start to understand why we need sulfur and why we need to apply it with our nitrogen? So we know that sulfur actually increases the utilization efficiency of nitrogen, and therefore that's why we often say we need to apply it at the same time for that optimum response. If we look at this graph, then you can see that differing rates of sulfur have had a positive effect on the increase of kilograms of grain per kilogram of nitrogen. So the nitrogen rate is the same throughout all these treatments, but we've just got differing amounts of sulfur. And you can see, therefore, that the addition of sulfur is what's improved the utilization of nitrogen in this plant to increase the amount of grain. So increasing efficiency of all processes on farm is really becoming ever more important, and especially efficiency of nutrient uptake in general, not just nitrogen uptake. So we need to improve all nutrient uptake efficiencies. And of course, with this, you're getting better value for money. You're getting more from what you're spending on nutrients because we're getting a better uptake efficiency there. So as I mentioned earlier, there's several reasons why we need to apply sulfur little and often. Leaching would be an issue with sulfur, and we need to treat it the same as nitrogen here and not apply it all in one application because it's unlikely to meet that season-long demand that we saw earlier. The source of sulfur is also important. If we're applying sulfur at that first nitrogen timing when we want the crop to take it up as quickly as possible, then we need to use a source of sulfur that's immediately plant available, and that's sulfate. So if you plan on using elemental sulfur, then just be aware there is that delay in the availability whilst the sulfur is undergoing that conversion into sulfate. And what we don't want to do at that kind of critical early timing is delay the uptake of nitrogen through that lack of sulfur whilst it's waiting to be converted. So yeah, we want to get that crop out of winter as soon as possible. So yeah, if we look at some trials work, to show the different benefits of applying sulfur little and often. You can see the oilseed trial here shows the difference between applying all early, all late, and then little and often. And the difference between all early and little and often is 0.2 tonnes per hectare, which at the prices when I created this graph were about £76 per hectare more. And if we think of today's kind of futures prices, then that's nearer £100 now. The second trial that you can see there is on wheat, and this compared straight nitrogen with Axan, which is one of our nitrogen sulfur products, and that was used all the way through, and you can see we've got a yield increase, quite a phenomenal one here, of 1.4 tonnes per hectare. So again, pricing at the time of creating this was an extra £228, but again, if we use current futures prices, then that's going to be nearer, say, £290 per hectare. So on average, if we look at all the trials that we've done in recent years for wheat, firstly, then we get an average benefit of 0.85 tonnes per hectare from sulfur applications, and that gives us an ROI of 5.4 to 1. For oilseed, the average yield benefit is about half a tonne a hectare, and again, that gives us an ROI of 7 to 1. However, again, if we use today's prices, then you're going to get an even better, almost unbelievable return on investment there. So yeah, definitely worth the investment for that addition of sulfur. So if we move on to phosphate and potassium now, we've spoken previously about availability of phosphate in the soil. And first and foremost, it is affected by the soil pH. So if your soils are below 6.5, then that's going to start to greatly reduce the availability of phosphate in the crop. Another major influence of phosphate availability is the soil temperature. And if we look at that small graph top right, then you can see that once soil temperatures are below about 8 degrees C, you really start to have an impact upon the phosphate availability with about 10% available there. And during the winter months, this isn't an issue, of course, as the crops aren't necessarily growing, but as we move towards the spring, soil temperatures take quite a while to warm up, so we're still looking at those low temperatures through February and March. Adding to this as well, that the crop's potentially got a small root system, particularly if there's been waterlogging throughout the winter, and that means a low uptake efficiency as well as those crops start to grow. And don't forget, the crops start to grow at 5 degrees C, whereas the phosphate availability is still pretty low there. And finally, crop demand increases from March to May. You'll have seen this graph before if you've watched our webinars, but you can see there's a massive 70% uptake of P taken up in that short window of 4 to 8 weeks. So therefore, when you add all these three factors together, we can see why fresh phosphate in the spring is the best option. And applying P as an NPKS product at that first nitrogen timing gives the crop available P when the soil reserves are still limited by that temperature. And this fresh P and K will also start to grow that poor root system, which then in turn means a better uptake efficiency, so you're going to be getting more into the crop quicker. And we need to feed the crop when the demand is there. So this again will start to increase efficiency of the products applied because we're using them when the crop requires them and saving on that potential P and K loss into the environment. We've done trials work comparing autumn and spring applications of P and K. And you can see here this was 12 different sites. And out of those 12, we've got 10 that showed a benefit from that spring applied P and K. And if we look at the average, which is the columns on the end, then we're getting on average 0.31 tonnes per hectare or a 4.15% yield increase from that spring applied P and K. So as well as timing of phosphate, also there are different types of phosphate within products which also make a difference on the length of supply that an application will give you. So there's three main sources of phosphate: orthophosphate, polyphosphate, and then dicalcium phosphate. And each of these will act differently once you've applied them to the soil. If we take ortho to start off with, then that's immediately available to the crop because it's water soluble. And that sounds great, but the issue is that up to 40% of what you've applied can actually become unavailable to the crop after, say, a 2-week period. And this is due to being absorbed with iron and aluminium ions or precipitated out with calcium ions. So effectively, it's still in the soil, but it's not plant available anymore. Another source is polyphosphate, and that's basically a long chain of orthophosphate. So therefore it takes a bit longer to break down in the soil to become the orthophosphate, which is then the immediately available part. So therefore, by having a product that's got this longer chain of polyphosphate that breaks down, we've got a longer supply of phosphate when they're in combination in a product. And then finally, there's the dicalcium phosphate, or the DCP, and this isn't water soluble, and therefore it isn't immediately available to the plant. DCP is broken down by acids that are exuded by the plant roots themselves when they're actively looking for nutrients. And again, this extends the phosphate availability for even longer. It's also not affected by iron or aluminium ions, and so it's a better option on more acidic soils as well, where phosphate availability might be affected. So you can see here from this graph, the MAP, DAP, TSP kind of products are pretty much almost 100% ortho. Other competitor NPKs, we've got 90% and then 10% DCP. But then when we look at the two Yara Mila, when we've got a granule, we've got 70% ortho, 30% DCP, and then in the prills we've got that mixture of all three products there. So you can see, if I move on to the next slide, how that starts to give a season-long continuous supply when you've got all those three forms of phosphate in there. And you can see we're still getting phosphate released even at over 70 days after application. We also carry out trials looking at different product options, and this trial was looking at an NPKS product applied all the way through the season on a crop of wheat versus Axan, which is one of our NS products. And the difference, of course, here is the P and K, which is in the extra grass, which is that green data set that you can see there on the slide. And you can see from this approach, we have seen a yield increase of 4.9% at that 220 kilograms of N per hectare kind of rate, which would be around the N-opt value that we'd be looking for there. Another one, again, comparing some different strategies for P&K applications. And you can see from the second treatment where we've had an NPKS as the first dressing followed by NS for the subsequent dressings, that we have got a yield benefit from that P&K. But also if we look at the two NPKS products towards the right hand side, you can see these were little and often, so applied all the way through. And we've got another small increase in yield for that. So year on year, we always see a benefit of applying an NPKS all the way through the season with that little and often approach. So just an overview of NPK and S. Spring applications with Yara mealie grades, you're typically going to see a 0.3 tonne per hectare yield advantage. Apply the P&K when the crop demand is highest for that optimum uptake efficiency. We've got that improved efficiency and a season-long supply with that P-Extend kind of feature with all the different types of phosphate. And then we're looking for an application of around 25 to 35 kilograms per hectare for P&K. And of course, those rates aren't going to address long-term fertility. They are a maintenance dressing, but they will give you that spring starter yield response, which is what we're after at that time of year. So if we head on to the physical properties of fertiliser, what do we need to think about? So I guess one of the first things we need to think about is the strength of the prill or granule. And I've got a short video here just demonstrating what we mean by the strength of fertiliser. So this device that you can see here is a strength tester, which shows how much pressure was applied to the prill or granule before it shattered with a scale of 0 to 10. And this first product is a competitor granule, and we can see that we're getting 5s and 4s on the strength tester. So luckily I'm not going to show you all 30. I'll cut now to hopefully once I've done the 30 tests, and we'll see. You can see we've got a 4 again, and on average, once I'd done all of those, we were getting 4.8 as the strength test from 30 different tests. So now if we head on to the Yara product, so we're looking at Extran 33.5% N. Now we're doing the same thing, so I'm going to test another 30 granules, and you can see here I'm getting a 9.5 here, and yeah, generally 7s, 8s, 9s and 10s for this. So again, once I've gone through this, you can see that the average is coming out a lot higher here at 7.9, so a lot higher on that strength score. And as I say, there was some 10s in there. So why do we care? Why do we want a strong particle? So if you imagine the speed that the spreader vane is actually hitting the fertiliser at, if the scores are low, then the particle is likely to shatter on impact, which will create dust and also an uneven spread pattern. Which you can see nicely here in this picture. We've got a blended product versus the compound Yara mealie product here, and you can see on impact some of those particles in the blend have shattered and created that dust. And as I say, that's then likely to cause an uneven spread pattern as well. Another aspect is bulk density, which is the weight of a given fertiliser, a given volume of fertiliser. Each fertiliser will have a different bulk density. So as an example, Yara Bella Extran will have a bulk density of 1 kilogram per litre, compared to, say, a granular urea, which will only have a bulk density of 0.7 kilograms per litre. And another way to think about it is that a heavier particle will actually travel further. And we do have a short video from one of my colleagues to show this in a very practical way, which we'll show at the end of my presentation here. But yeah, it's a very good analogy to try and really understand the meaning behind bulk density. Another aspect of getting a good spread pattern is using compound fertiliser, where all the nutrients are in either one prill or granule, rather than having different sizes and shapes. When you're applying a blend where the N, P, K and S are separate, then you have to set the spreader up for the most important nutrient, which of course is nitrogen. And that means that you're then compromising on the others that are in there, because they would actually have different spreader settings if they were being spread on their own. So if all the nutrients are in one particle, then of course that can't happen. Each landing site will contain the N, P, K and S analysis, or whatever the analysis is on the bag, with no variability, and also there's no segregation in the hopper as well. And for example, if we think of Activa S, one of our NPKS products, versus a blend, then in 1 meter squared there's up to 10 times more landing sites for phosphate and even more for potash. And you can see here, this is a different product. Again, we're looking at extra grass, and you can see the difference in colours. So we've got quite an even spread of nitrogen, but then if you look at the phosphate, we've just got the 3 red phosphates there, and if we look at the potash, we've just got the 1. So yeah, that's how you can see that we soon start to get a lot more landing sites for each of those nutrients. So finally, if I move on to emissions, I've put an important new consideration, because to some people emissions might not be part of a fertilizer choice, but I think over time this is going to become more and more important, whether that's fertilizer production or on farm. So Yara, we have some something called abatement technology, which means our fertilizers are amongst the lowest in terms of CO2 emissions during production. So comparing that to, say, further afield, so outside of Europe, then some of those will have a lot higher CO2 emissions. So that's one consideration. But as well as CO2, then we have ammonia emissions as another key driver. And you'll have heard a lot about these. The government has some very high targets to dramatically reduce ammonia emissions in the coming years, and hence that's been the focus on the urea, and that's why we've had the urea consultation. Urea has higher ammonia emissions, and certainly in dry springs, then this really has an impact, because if used this year in a dry spring, then we would have had a lot more volatilization of urea because of those dry, warm conditions. So the source of nitrogen chosen does make a big impact on ammonia emissions. If we look at this work here, you can see the various different options. If we look at AN, we've got 2.7 there. And then if we look at urea, you're up to 13.8. So just by switching from urea to AN, you're already reducing your emissions by 5 times. As well, you might think, well, I'll use an inhibitor, but if we look at some of the work here, in the red circles, we've got the AN at 3 and the inhibitor here at 7. So we're still more than 2 times the emissions of urea plus an inhibitor. So AN really is one of the lowest to go for if you're conscious of those emissions from farm. So after all that, what products are a good fit? Then the first application really as an NPKS, then we're looking at something like Activa S that we've got here. As I say, you could use that all the way through if you wanted, because we do see those yield increases with that. But if you want a nitrogen sulfur product for subsequent applications, then we've got here Yara Axan. So yeah, those are our 2 good fitting products. We've got all those quality parameters, but also environmentally, emission wise, then we're also good to go on these products. So as a kind of an overview of everything, don't rush your decision or be pushed into ordering just what you had last year without any planning. Make sure you do plan. Make sure you take into account P, K and S requirements, and really think about how much straight nitrogen you actually need. If you want to spread to those larger bout widths, then make sure that you take those physical characteristics into account when choosing a product. And then finally, if you want to make conscious choices about sustainability and improving air quality, then also take this into account when choosing a fertiliser as well. And things like this are only going to become more and more important as the government puts pressure on us to meet more environmental targets. So thank you. I shall now hand over back to Eva.
Great, thanks Natalie. So many thanks, and yes, we hope to be back soon. Take care.